Tēnā koutou e ngā mata waka. Kia koutou te mana whenua, tēnā koutou. Ngā mate huhuia o te wā, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Hoki mai kia tātou te kona hiore e tēnei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tēnā koutou e ranga e te kaupapa o te rā. Noi reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you at the Community Housing Aotearoa Conference. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge you, Paul, and the other organisers of this event, and of course you attendees. I can't thank you enough for the efforts that you do. And welcome to Otatahi Christchurch, everybody. It's great to have you in our city. And I'd like to acknowledge the previous speaker, my friend, the Deputy Mayor, Pauline Cotter, for the work that Christchurch City does. Through COVID and more recently, during the recent devastating weather events, your work not only as suppliers of houses, but as organisations deeply embedded in your communities has been invaluable to us getting through. I, along with my fellow ministers, and I acknowledge Minister Marama Davidson is also here and will be speaking to you later today, have had the privilege of regularly meeting with many of you as you tirelessly worked through these incredibly difficult times. Thank you for your mahi and for your care, your compassion, and the aroha you showed. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the victims of Loafers Lodge, a tragedy that none of us ever wanted to see. One of the things that struck me was that for many New Zealanders, the mere existence of a lodge, of a housing situation like Loafers Lodge, came as a shock. But I know that for you, this is a reality that you face every day. The most vulnerable in our housing system who need our help and support. And I'd like to acknowledge your work that you do every day. It is invaluable, particularly as we all work together to solve a housing crisis with urgency. Our work together is not limited to just delivering the sorely needed public housing that we need in this country. Over the last 5 years, we have together rolled out a progressive home ownership scheme at a scale that we have never seen before in this country, and our work is not done. And together, we are now looking at how we can rebuild the affordable rental sector in New Zealand. And I'll come back to that later in my speech. Together, we have rolled out Whai Kāinga Whaioranga, by Māori, for Māori solutions for our housing crisis. I am immensely proud of this work. This is not just talk. With the money in this year's budget, there's now $1 billion available for this work, a point that my colleague Minister Willie Jackson likes to point out many, many times. But he is leading an exceptional program of work that repairs and improves existing homes, builds more houses for Māori, including new homes on Papakainga, and allows for the infrastructure to build those houses in the communities where people want to live. And importantly, it boosts the skills and resources to organisations so that there can be the delivery of Māori-led solutions. Our work to tackle homelessness is another area where our partnership is crucial. And we need to do this together. Undoubtedly, Associate Minister of Housing, Marama Davidson, who is leading this work, will talk far more about this later this morning, so I won't dwell on this. But I will say that this year's budget, with its focus on rangatahi homelessness, is something that we know is critical. Transitional housing provides warm, dry and safe short-term accommodation for people in need, along with tailored support, and it is an important part of our public housing infrastructure. We could not do this without you. Since October 2017, over 4,000 more transitional housing places are available up and down our country, helping thousands of vulnerable New Zealanders and whānau, and there are more to come. Funding of $284 million through Budget 2022 is continuing to allow the government to build at pace and operate transitional housing. For our government, there has never been any doubt that there is a housing crisis. Over the 5 years in government, we have had an unrelenting focus on ways to end and fix this crisis. Is it fixed yet? Of course not. There is still plenty of work to do, but we are starting to see the green shoots of change. Right now, we are in a building boom, a bonanza, if you will, with well over 200,000 active consents underway for the building of homes. But what gives me hope is that part of this mix is social and affordable housing. This isn't what we saw after the GFC, where we saw a retreat into some of the least risky developments, which were unaffordable large homes. We are building the houses that will help us fix a housing crisis. Embedded deep within the DNA of the Labour Party and Labour Ministers of Housing is an unwavering belief and commitment to the role of government in housing. The market simply will not deliver for our most vulnerable, and for nearly 90 years, there has been an acceptance that the public provision of housing is needed for our most vulnerable. I consider myself an heir to an incredible Labour legacy in housing. From Mickey Savage and Bob Semple onwards, we have built houses. So far, this government has delivered almost 12,000 public homes and more than 4,000 transitional homes. What's more, right now there are over 4,500 public housing places currently under construction, many of which will be delivered by June 2024. We are building more public houses in greater numbers than in decades. 1 in 7 of the public houses that exist today were delivered by our government in the last 5 years. This is a simply staggering statistic when you consider that this is a build program that has been underway since 1937. So it is fitting that this year's theme is unlocking the power of local. Local knowledge is critical to informing our approach to developing housing supply and solution. The one-size-fits-all approach does not serve any of us well. Your local knowledge of what you see happening in your communities is critical to informing how the government responds to the housing crisis, to severe weather events, and the impact of a cost of living crisis. This is why planning for the housing and urban development system now takes a place-based approach that works in partnership with council, with iwi, and with community housing providers in those regions. As we know, fixing any crisis requires a collective effort. We all must do our part. So while I believe passionately in an active role for the state through Kāinga Ora, I do not for a moment believe that we can do this alone. We have to work in partnership with you, our community partners, our community housing providers. It's not a dichotomy of KO or CHIPS. It's about how we can work in complementary way to provide the houses that we sorely need. Our actions and record attest to this commitment. When we came into government, there were 5,000 CHIP public housing places. As of March 2023, there are 12,175 places. That's an increase of over 7,000 places under our government. You can further see our support for and commitment to the CHIP sector to the increase in operating funding that is going to the sector. When we came into government, there was $95 million in the 2016-2017 budget in operating funding going to CHIPS. In 2021-2022, that was $539 million. We have also entered into long-term contracts with CHIPS to unlock access to funding for the building of many of the homes that you are adding to the stock. Usually these contracts are between 10 and 25 years. We currently have around 100 of these contracts with over 30 different chips. So how did we get into our current housing crisis? There are many complex clauses of the housing crisis, but in the simplest terms, we are still grappling with decades of underinvestment. We are looking to address these systemic barriers to having enough houses, whether they are public, community, or privately owned, through our direct investment in housing infrastructure. For the first time since the 1970s, our government is putting investment into the housing infrastructure, or as I say, that's the fancy term for roads and pipes that make houses possible. There is $3.8 billion of this investment through the Housing Acceleration Fund, and it is already being rolled out. $1 billion of that is working in partnership with communities right through our country, with councils, with iwi, with developers who have ideas of how they can bring affordable houses to bear. And this is already being rolled out. And this is the kind of investment that allows us to build more houses, including public houses. But when it comes to the shortage of public housing we are currently experiencing, the causes are glaringly obvious. Between 2008 and 2017, there was a government intent on selling off state houses. The National Party will tell you that this is okay, because it doesn't matter who owns the houses and they were sold to the community providers. This is simply not correct. I have looked at the numbers, and in 2017, when we came into government, there were 1,500 fewer public houses across both Housing New Zealand and the CHIPS sector than when we left office in 2008. Not only were houses being sold off, there was also an absolute failure to deliver new housing stock. Then Housing New Zealand had essentially become an agency to sell off assets rather than build warm, dry homes for New Zealanders. If the National Party had delivered at the rate we are over our first 6 years in government, we would have an additional 20,000 public houses today. That would take up most of our current waiting list. So when I hear the current National Housing spokespeople trotting out the same old rhetoric about how a national government are going to get out of the way and let the community sector provide, that it does not matter who owns the homes, I am afraid. When I hear the continued attacks on KO from the opposition, and at the best disingenuous claims about how inefficient Kāinga Ora is, I am afraid. Claims that I have heard from the National Party that Kāinga Ora were gearing up to spend over $1 million per house from funding in this year's budget is both wrong and misleading. When I heard Nicola Willis on the radio this morning listing public housing spending and Kāinga Ora's spending as a place to look for cuts to fund $8.4 billion worth of tax cuts, a shiver went down my spine. This is what we have heard before, and it is a code for a dereliction of duty. It is a code for pillaging and asset stripping. It is a code for flogging off housing and failing to do your bit to add to the stock. It is a code for not adequately funding the growth in government operating funding needed to enable public housing, whether it is delivered by Kāinga Ora or by the CHIPS sector. It is a code for a lack of commitment to public housing in New Zealand. This is a rational fear to have because we have seen it before between 2008 and 2017. For our government, it's not a matter of the community sector or KO. It is a commitment to making funding available for both. Over the last couple of years, as I have looked closely for the solutions we need to fix this crisis, to repair the scars of the decimation of public housing under the previous government, I have become more and more convinced that in setting up a competitive model between the state housing provider and CHIPS for operating funding, an additional wound was inflicted. That was the provision of the affordable social rental sector. Houses that sat between state houses where the inhabitants could attract the income-related rent subsidy and the private rental sector. Modest and affordable homes provided by council, iwi and community organisations with some capital support that could be rented out at affordable rent levels and made good use of the accommodation supplement. In affordable housing, we are looking to heal this wound. The Affordable Housing Fund of $350 million offers grant funding to not-for-profit organisations to deliver that newly built affordable rental housing. But to be clear, this is not instead of IRRS-funded places for our community sector. It is in addition to it, and I consider it is absolutely critical that we rebuild this part of our housing continuum if we are to fix our current housing crisis. So this brings me to Budget 2023. And I'm proud to stand here following last week's budget announcement of the 2023 Hipkins Labor government budget. Budget 2023 continues the government's commitment to tackling the housing shortage, supporting more people at risk of homelessness, building more houses for Māori, and supporting those impacted by recent severe weather events. We're building on the government's record public housing program by providing funding to deliver an additional 3,000 public homes by June 2025. In Budget 23, we also set aside $465 million in ongoing operational funding for income-related rent subsidies required to deliver those additional 3,000 public homes by June 2025. Alongside the operating supplement, these are key parts of sustaining the amount of public housing we have collectively created over the last 6 years. As you know, it is not capital spending alone that delivers public housing. IRRS and the operating supplement are the magical ingredients that make the house a public house. So to hear the National Party criticism that we have waited until an election year budget to confirm IRRS funding is again both disingenuous and misleading. In the last budget National delivered in 2017, there was a $918 million operating funding, including IRRS, spread across CHIPS and Housing New Zealand. This year, ongoing commitments through each of our 6 budgets that we have delivered, we are on track to spend $1.8 billion in operating funding and IRRS funding. This is an 88% increase in funding, and this is what a real commitment to public housing in New Zealand looks like. And that is why we have been able to so massively increase the amount of funding going into our chip sector, because in each and every budget we have provided for it. It has been a priority for our government. It is true that this year's budget delivered funding out to June 2025. This allows for the pipeline planning required to crack on. But let me be clear, all political parties at this election will need to show what their commitment in the next term would look like. All political parties will need to put their respective pennies down in their costed manifestos and tell the country how many places they are committed to delivering. Parties will need to demonstrate to the electorate where public housing sits in their priorities. How does it stack up, say for example, against tax cuts for some of the wealthiest New Zealanders? It is not enough to say that your grand plan is to let the community sector to deliver and leave it at that. We need to see laid bare where the operating funding commitment sits. This is what a commitment to public housing, whether it is delivered by KO or by the community sector, looks like. And as I have you all in the room here today, I'm sure you'd like me to give you an update on the New Zealand Public Housing Plan, which sets out the government's public housing supply intentions until June 2025. The updated public housing plan is a signal to community housing providers, kāinga ora and Māori and iwi partners where the additional delivery of housing will be focused out to June 2025. I know who will deliver this housing and where it will be delivered are probably the burning questions of the conference. On the who, I have asked Andrew Crisp and the HUD team to lead a process with kāinga ora, chips and councils to build a plan from the ground up. I want to understand all of the pipelines of all of our organisations in the priority areas, which I will come back to across all of us that is intent on fixing this crisis. It is my expectation that we will have that indicative plan by the end of June and have detailed delivery plans by August. A focus for us going forward will be where we build public homes, particularly focusing on increasing supply in the regions. When I became the Minister of Housing, one of the settings I looked at closely was the funding model that would allow us to build outside of our main metro cities. I had invaluable feedback from many of you in this room that the funding model just did not stack up. We listened and we made the changes. We increased the rent maxima outside of the cities and we increased the operating supplement. And this has paid dividends. Not dividends that we have extracted of $500 million from the state housing provider like the previous government, but for us the dividend is seeing more houses. We are seeing the fruits of this change in the form of new supply in places that bore some of the deepest scars of the state house sell-off of the previous decade. So if I have a look at two examples, in October 2017, there was one place provided in Northland by a community housing provider. And today, there are now 160 public houses provided by a community housing provider. On the east coast of the North Island, one of our areas of greatest housing need, even before the recent weather events, there were fewer than 40 community housing provider public housing places in October 2017. Since then, CHIPS have been able to increase the number of places by over 120 places. That is places where over 120 families and individuals can transform their lives. The budget also provided a total of $700 million in income-related rent subsidy funding to maintain delivery of the existing and planned public housing, reflecting our government's commitment to providing long-term, secure public housing. This funding is being used in part to fund the additional costs that need to be carried in making sure that the funding settings are right for delivering on the plan. We have shown our willingness to both listen and to act when it comes to getting those settings right. And my commitment to you all is to continue to do this. Delivery to date has been strong, and the funding for the income-related rent subsidy from Budget 2023 builds on this momentum, and it will do so again, particularly in our regions. I want us collectively to go hunting for opportunities in the regions, in the places where it has been hard to build, but we simply must. I want us to collectively sit around the table and identify those opportunities together and to build that plan from the ground up. When I look at the numbers across the region, the scars of the damage wreaked by the previous policy are all too stark. These are where we simply need to build back. In some places, we are making good headway into healing the damage. In other places, we need to bring our collective energy and expertise. In Dunedin, we saw a loss of 135 homes between 2008 and 2017. In the far north, a loss of 98 houses. In New Plymouth, a loss of 115 houses. In Rotorua, a loss of 42 houses. In Ruapehu, a loss of 66 houses. In Hastings, a loss of 192 houses. And in Invercargill, a loss of 77 houses. This is what we have to turn around together. And this is what I know all of you are committed to doing. As the providers of housing, you can see that there's a lot of good work in progress. But we also know, more than most, that there is so much more work to do. More public houses need to be built as quickly as possible so people can move into them and off the public housing register. We fix a housing crisis by building more houses. We fix a housing crisis by continuing to nurture and grow the intergenerational taonga of public housing we inherited from governments who had the foresight and understood that at the heart of a decent and functioning society is the security of a home. To close, I will leave you with the words of former Prime Minister Norman Kirk, who said there are 4 things that matter to people: that they have somewhere to live, food to eat, clothing to wear, and to have something to hope for. This government's vision for housing continues to be that everybody in Aotearoa lives in a happy, healthy, warm, dry home and lives within a community that meets their needs and allows their aspirations to flourish. CHIPs are critically important to communities, and I thank you for the work you are doing and that we will do together. Ngā mihi nui.
Yes, okay. In the exit stage left, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Minister Woods, just wondering what the vision is for places that particularly intergenerational poverty, issues of layers of inequity. Is there a special plan to look in particular at areas that have been most hard hit? I live in Rotorua.
Thank you, and yes, and that's very much where our place-based approach is the way through that. I think Rotorua is a really good example. That it was one of the provincial cities that I read out what the loss of housing had been, of 44 houses. We've now delivered, I think it's 127, I can't remember offhand, but there's about another 300 odd houses in the pipeline. But I think absolutely critical to making sure that we do take this place-based approach as bringing our by Māori for Māori solutions to bear and integrating and making sure that it's all working together. The work that we're able to do around some of the innovative work around papakainga housing, the way that we're able to repair some of those homes and make them warm, dry homes that exist there. So it's about sitting down with locals. It's about examining what the causes and the drivers are, and from there we can collectively come to the solutions. And that's exactly what we've done in Rotorua and in Hastings. I have to say that we are exceptionally blessed for the partnerships that we have formed on the East Coast in terms of addressing what is going to be part of the recovery in that area. And that is by working with Council, and it is by working with iwi. Thank you.
One more?
Done. Okay.
Good morning, Minister. I do have one quick question. Are you leaving? It's Kate Kearney over this way.
Okay.
Again, thank you so much for what you've done for housing in New Zealand. You've really been remarkable with the number of new places. Just coming back to the affordable housing, you mentioned 3,000 public places up to June 25. I may have not heard if you mentioned affordable places in the budget up to finance year 25?
No, the funding was for the income-related rent subsidy to allow us to continue out the public house build, that we're still working through the $350 million that we put aside. And look, I'm under no illusions that $350 million fund that we set up around affordable housing was really about how we start to rebuild that missing bit that sits between public housing and the private rental market. There is more work to be done. That has not been completed yet. But in terms of, we all know that if we are going to continue to build public houses, that you've got to have the income-related rent subsidy funding there. When we first came into government, it wasn't until our first budget in 2018 that we could really make a commitment around ramping up the building, because there simply hadn't been enough income-related rent subsidy put aside in the budget that we didn't deliver in 2017. I think we were able to deliver 1,000, and that first year, but it's in subsequent budgets where we ramped up the income-related rent subsidy that we're able to roll out the public housing. So this is our continued commitment to that, Kate, and I can't see where you are. It's really just... Oh, there you are. Yeah. How could I miss your jacket, Kate? That it is about ramping up that and making sure we can continue that commitment. But we know that there is far more to do in that bit that sits between public housing and the private rental market. Thank you. Cheers.
That's a nice segue because we've got another bunch of locals. We're doing really well with Unlocking Local today, right? So thank you so much, Minister. I really appreciate your time.